In this presentation, we're going to look at a variety of methods that researchers use to collect data. We'll also look at some of the invalid or unethical methods that researchers use, either accidentally or intentionally. When conducting an observational study, like an opinion poll, it's important that questions don't influence the participants' answers.